We all like to remember our first time, don't we? What do you think I mean? This is my second Global Speakers Summit. Don't know what the giggle was. My first Global Speakers Summit was in Vancouver in 2013. And beyond what was shared on the stage over the course of those few days, I have two long-lasting memories of that event. The first one came straight away, on arrival. My flight was late. With a group of other UK speakers, we turned up at the hotel and the lobby was packed with international speakers. They were all getting ready to go on the cruise before the conference began. The party cruise. You don't want to miss the party cruise before the conference begins. So I checked in really quickly. I went to my room. I dropped my bags. I didn't take my coat off. My hat didn't get changed. Straight back out onto the bus, out to the cruise. Got onto the boat. And you know when you've been traveling a long time, you've been delayed, you get to the hotel, you're not ready to really interact with people. You need to reset for a moment, don't you? So I went out onto the deck to just reset. It was minus whatever degrees. I didn't need very long to reset. I stood on that deck, I thought, okay, I've reset now, and I went back onto the boat. And I was on the top deck, and the top deck was the disco deck. You all know the disco deck on the cruise. And it doesn't take professional speakers long to find the disco deck. So there were already a group of speakers all dancing on the deck, really showing their moves. You're going to see these moves over the next couple of nights, I'm sure. And I joined them. I still have my coat on, I still have my hat on, and I was wearing my glasses. Now, anyone who wears glasses will tell you what happens when you go from a very cold temperature into a very warm one. So the first impression that group of international speakers got of me was this. So that was my first experience of the Global Speakers Summit in Vancouver. The second one wasn't perhaps such a light moment. Like most summits, like most national conventions, there was a charity auction where a number of speakers donated lots and we raised money for a speaking charity. There's one at this event as well. And I'd been encouraged to submit a lot for the auction. Now, I was under no pretense, no illusions. I knew that, okay, I'd been a member of the PSA for 10 years at that stage. I'd been a fellow for 2 years, but I hadn't really built my international speaking reputation at that point. Probably hadn't built my UK speaking reputation to a huge degree at that point. My lot was a referral mentoring session with me. I wasn't expecting it to be the most popular lot in the auction. Wasn't expecting a feeding frenzy. I just hoped I would save face, that we'd get a bid or two, and we'd raise some money for the charity. My lot came up. There was silence for a while, and then there was a bid. And what a bid. It came from one of the legends of the speaking industry, an NSA Hall of Famer who, if I mention his name, I haven't got hold of him to get his permission, so I can't share his name, you would know who he is. I knew that this was nothing more than a pity bid, but I was going to take it. I would absolutely take that bid. And so I saved face. I wasn't humiliated. At least I wasn't humiliated for a couple of hours. And then a couple of hours later, they interrupted proceedings from the stage. And they said there was a mistake in the auction. And one of the bids wasn't actually a bid. He didn't know he was bidding. So Andy Lopata's lot is back available. And this time, nobody bid. Now, I can tell by your reaction that you know exactly how I felt in that moment. I was humiliated. I wanted the ground to open up beneath me and swallow me whole. I wanted never, ever to come to a Global Speakers Summit again. I probably wanted to leave the PSA at that stage and never see any of you ever again. Some of you might be wishing this moment that I had followed that route. It all ended up okay. On the last day of the convention, after the convention had finished on the Sunday lunchtime, I joined my good friends Alan Stevens and Heather Waring for lunch. I went down to join them for lunch, and to my horror, there was one other person at that table. And can you guess who it was? It was that NSA Hall of Famer that had led to my humiliation. And do you know how I felt as I walked up there? Angry, humiliated. This is the last person I ever want to talk to in my life. He was so nice about it. He was so apologetic. He didn't know what was going on. He was just in deep conversation with friends when the auction was going on, probably waving his arms around, and didn't even hear his name mentioned when the bid was there. He was lovely about it, and we connected over that. But here's the thing. He didn't realise it happened. Alan, Heather, hadn't recognised it happened. I know a number of you in this room were at that convention. You probably haven't got a clue what I'm talking about. It was me that noticed. It was me that was humiliated. I was driven by my ego. And let's face it, we all have an ego. It plays a role. You can't get on this stage without some kind of ego. Let it get you on this stage, but don't let it get in your way afterwards. We're so focused sometimes on what we perceive people to think about us that we miss what they really do. We're so focused on what we perceive people to think about us that we don't allow for real connection. And that's what we need to do. I believe that as thought leaders, as community leaders, as leaders of people, we need to be open and we need to be vulnerable and we need to get beyond our ego to truly connect with other people. Culturally, I think we have been conditioned to see leaders and leadership and vulnerability as different polar opposites. We expect our leaders to be strong and we want to see them to be strong. Vulnerability doesn't allow for that, does it? We expect our leaders to be resilient and to be seen to be resilient. Vulnerability doesn't allow for that, does it? We expect our leaders to lead and to be seen to lead. No room for vulnerability there. Or is there? I believe there is. I believe that far from being a polar opposite, vulnerability helps us to be strong. It helps us to be resilient. It helps us to be seen to take the lead. We're seeing a change in the culture. People are talking about this more. In Christmas last year, the Financial Times wrote an editorial calling for a new era of empathy, saying we need new leaders who are vulnerable. But that change isn't happening quickly enough. Anyone who saw the response of the CEOs of the big banks to hybrid working and working from home knows that command and control is still strong and it's still powerful. And let me be clear, I'm not saying that your whole leadership approach should be vulnerable. It's a dimension of it. But we need to create the space for it. We need to be open to it. So what I want to look at is those three areas. Being strong, being resilient, being seen to lead, and explore just how vulnerability helps you in those scenarios. So let's start with being strong. For my book, Just Ask, I interviewed the researchers from Harvard Business School who put together a study that came out in 2019. And what they wanted to look at was the impact of people's perception of you on how they took in your message, how they related to your message. And they ran a series of experiments. And one of those experiments, the final one, was a Dragon's Den, or what's the American? Shark Tank, thank you. A Dragon's Den or Shark Tank type event with pitching competition. And they ran two scenarios with the same people. And in the first scenario, this business owner would talk about how great their business was, how fantastic, all the successes they had, all the strengths it had. And in the second scenario, the same pitch. But interweaved in that story was all the failures along the way, all the challenges they faced, everything they'd got wrong. And they measured two types of envy. They measured benign envy. Benign envy is where people want to be like you. And they measured malicious envy, where people want you to fail. And it won't surprise you to know that in the first scenario, where they were just talking about how wonderful they were, malicious envy was high. In the second scenario, where they interwove those failures along the way, benign envy was high. And I can see you nodding, and I could relate to this straight away. It took me back to a very early talk in my career. And it wasn't a special talk by any means. It was a presentation I delivered many times. It was to a relatively small audience. It was for Barclays Bank, which is one of the main high street banks in the UK. And it was to about 20 or 30 local business customers, so small business owners. It was in East London, in Whitechapel. If you're an aficionado of London history, it's opposite the Blind Beggar pub, which is very famous in the story of the Cray twins and London's gangland story. And I delivered the same talk I delivered all the time. But that talk, like this one, had 3 key points. And I used to illustrate it with a story for each point. But I had delivered that talk so many times that I could change my stories at a whim. And it was really the mood I was in. It might be something that I'd shared many times. It might be something that happened that week. It might have been something that happened, a conversation in the networking before I spoke. Now, I don't know if you're the same as me, but one of my first measures of how well a talk has gone down is how people respond to me in the audience afterwards and in the networking afterwards. Am I mobbed and people want to talk to me, or am I left on my own? I was mobbed that evening. I was absolutely mobbed, and the buzz in the room was really high. And I thought to myself, why? What's the difference? Why is this so strong? Why is this so high? And I realised it was the 3 stories. Because every one of those stories contained a failure that I had learned from. Accident, not design, but the measure was huge. The shift was absolutely huge. We wear masks as speakers. We wear masks as leaders. And we have to wear masks as leaders. Yesterday, Pegeen talked about the motivational speaker and depression. You're feeling rough one morning or one day, your client doesn't care if they've booked you to motivate their team. You've got to put that mask on, haven't you? And you've got to turn up and give them positivity and the messages that that team needs to hear. They don't care about your troubles. But that doesn't mean you wear that mask all the time. There are moments when you can allow it to drop. There are moments when you allow people in. Because don't get me wrong, that mask is a barrier to connection. It's a barrier to trust. When we remove that mask, people are far more able to connect with the real us. And when they connect with the real us, our message is going to resonate so much more strongly. You do not have a right to stand on this stage and expect people to listen to you. You have to earn the right for them to want to hear what you have to say. And you do that by revealing your true self, by creating a strong connection with your audience, so that they're drawn into what you want to say and they really want to take it on board. So you're stronger as a leader, a thought leader, a leader of communities, if you connect with people on a genuine, real level, and you're open and vulnerable to allow that to happen. Leaders need to be strong, and they need to be seen to be strong. But that's not the polar opposite of vulnerability. They're intertwined. And the second area is resilience. We want our leaders to be resilient, and we want to see them to be resilient. Now, I'm not going to argue with that. I think that's really important, but vulnerability is an aid to resilience. It's not the opposite of it. If we look at what resilience is, and I'm not the expert on this in the room. I think Jodie, who's got the workshop, I think later today, will tell you a lot more. But I'm going to give you my definition of resilience. My definition of resilience is getting to your end goal despite what the world throws in your way. Is that fair enough? Getting to your end goal despite what the world throws in your way. Well, doesn't it make it easier to get to that objective if A, you can identify what those challenges are and deal with them, and B, you can get other people's support in getting there. So surely vulnerability and openness aids resilience rather than gets in the way of resilience. I was talking to a good friend of mine a few weeks ago, and I was going through my thoughts for the talk. He's one of the people that's really helped me put this presentation together and just acted as the person I could bounce ideas off, a guy called Paul McGee. Many of you will know Paul. He's one of the long-standing legends of the PSA world, brilliant speaker, author of Sumo. And we were talking about this point of resilience, and Paul said something very powerful to me. He reflected back to a time a few years ago that I was very aware of, because we'd talked a lot in that time, when Paul was going through a lot of personal issues, a lot of personal upheaval, and it was a really challenging time for him. Paul is one of the hardest working speakers I know in our community. He is constantly speaking every day, all over the country and abroad. And he turned up to every one of those talks and he delivered at the top of his game every single time. And what he said to me was, my biggest achievement was holding it together while inside I was falling apart. And he said, I did that because of the conversations I had with people like you. And there are other people in this room I know who would have had those conversations with Paul as well and will know what I'm talking about. This is a tough profession. This is a tough space to be. You know, we look glamorous on Instagram, don't we? We look fantastic on Facebook. We present the best of ourselves. But this is a profession where you spend a lot of time travelling on your own. Hotel rooms lose their glamour, don't they? There's a lot of loneliness in this space. This is a profession where, unless you've got that business model nailed that's scalable, you might be having the best quarter of your career, but you don't know what's coming the quarter after. This is a profession where you don't sleep for the best part of 3 months because you're speaking at the Global Speakers Summit. Where you sit there shaking before you go on stage thinking, why on earth am I doing this and putting myself through it? We need to be aware of that and we need to own that. We need to be okay with it and we need to create that space in our lives to handle that. I know a number of speakers now who are taking Fridays off, and that's becoming more and more common. At the end of August, I needed to speak to Graham Codrington, South African speaker. Many of you will know Graham. I was interviewing Graham, brief interview for a Psychology Today blog that came out this week. And we were trying to find a time to talk. And Graham said, how about next Tuesday at 9 a.m? Now, next Tuesday at 9 a.m. was the last Tuesday of August. Now, for many of us, August is a down month. It's a recharge month. And I normally look forward to just getting my energy back a bit. This August, I didn't have that chance. That last week of August was my only week in August where I could slow down. I still had to work and work hard, but I could slow down. So I had what I call a no alarm week, a Sunday week, where I wouldn't set my alarm in the morning. I would get up when my body was ready and then I'd start work. So I said to Graham, I can't talk at 9 a.m. So we rebooked another time. When we spoke, the first thing I said to Graham, I'm sorry I couldn't speak at 9 a.m. And he told me off. He said, never apologise for looking after yourself. Never apologise for putting yourself first. If we can't serve ourselves, how can we serve our audiences and the people who follow us? Understand what's holding you back, understand your limits and embrace. One of my favourite memories was a very early event I went to. And this little group of us were the last ones standing on the Saturday night. We got to bed about 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. Sweet, innocent times, Scott Johnson. No breakfast club there.
Lightweight?
Absolutely. You think I was a lightweight then? So this little group, you've got Paul McGee there in the middle, who I've just been talking about, Amanda Clark. Paul and Amanda and Clive Gott, who sadly missed, who would have taken that photo, they were the gods of the PSA. They didn't know me from Adam. They did after that session. It was an amazing turnaround. I didn't know any of these legends of the PSA, but after that, Paul and Amanda are still long-term friends. I'm seeing them next month when I'm speaking near where they live. Clive was phoning me for advice, which I didn't quite understand. Elaine went on to marry Clive pretty much on his deathbed. But she was a new member like me, and we all bonded, and it was magical. But I was reflecting on that with Paul on that call. And Paul said to me, he said, you know, the funny thing is, Andy, he said, these days, we're more likely to slip off to bed at 9:30 with a cup of cocoa. And no comments from anyone who's seen me do exactly that the last 2 nights. But last night is a good case in point when I talk about knowing your limits, because I'm not going to do that anymore. Well, I am, but not to that level. I'm now at the age where if I drink too much on the Saturday, I'm not just suffering on the Sunday. I'm suffering on the Wednesday. 3 weeks later. Last night, while you were out enjoying yourselves, I was Captain Sensible. While you were happy, talking, eating, drinking, I was in the hotel, having a quiet meal with a couple of friends. I went up to bed before Julie had even finished her meal, Mel had finished her meal, and I went through this talk. And I did a couple of lessons on Duolingo, I read my book of the Greek myths, and I tried to sleep. Because I knew my limits, and I knew what I needed to do. When you're at conventions and when you're at events like this, there's huge peer pressure to do what you don't naturally need to do. We need to get beyond that, and we need to be happy to just be ourselves and engage with people in the way that we can. There's one more thing on resilience that I'm toying with whether I talk about this or not, but I think it's a really important point. And Paul Tawal touched on this in the CSP meeting yesterday from his perspective. I got a polled inquiry through LinkedIn last week, and it said, I've been following you for a while based on someone's recommendation. He works for a pharmaceutical company, which is very important to me. That's a big sector for me. And he said, we have a leadership dinner at Christmas and we want you to speak because professional relationships, which is my topic, are really important to us. And I replied and I said, I've got this conference coming up. Can we speak? And we're going to talk next week. And I said, but the chances are I won't do it because it's after dinner. And I confirmed that. And I don't do after dinner talks. And Paul shared a similar story yesterday. That's easy for me to say, and it's probably easy for Paul to say, because our businesses are doing well. We can turn things down, but it's not always like that, is it? It wasn't like that a few years ago when my business was really struggling and I got approached by a national law firm who said, Andy, would you do after dinner for us? I said, I don't really do after dinner. They said, but we really want what you offer. And I said, well, I'll tell you what, if you take a scale from 0 to 10, where 10 is laugh out loud funny and 0 is pure content, where do you want to be? They said 2. I said, okay, I can manage that. Get to about 2. So I did the gigs. There were two talks. They split their partner group. The first group went okay. Wouldn't say I set the world on fire, Sean, but it went okay. I wasn't ignored. The second one, I was sat at the table over dinner with senior partners and experienced partners from the firm, and they were lovely. I'm really looking forward to what you have to say, really interested. Is this what you do? You know, the conversation you've all had. I delivered my talk. I sat down at that table. No one smiled at me. I walked through the room afterwards. No one approached me. I went to the packed bar afterwards. Everyone turned their back. At least that's what it felt like to me. No one spoke to me. I took that gig knowing it was wrong because I needed the money. The money I was paid for that was not worth the damage to my confidence. It was not worth the damage to my reputation. Resilience is about getting to your end goal. Part of that is not being knocked off course with something that's not in line with what you're trying to achieve. You have to be open to all of this. So resilience is about understanding what you're trying to achieve, understanding what's going to knock you off course and dealing with it with the help of other people and with your own mindset. And we should all be able to achieve that, shouldn't we? If a 14-year-old girl from Hampshire can do that, can we? One of the biggest news stories that caught my eye this year was a 14-year-old girl from Hampshire, south coast of England. She'd been on holiday, she'd been mauled by a crocodile. And it wasn't the mauling by the crocodile that caught my eye. It wasn't the fact she'd survived, which is wonderful, that caught my eye. It was her response. She was asked by a journalist, are you going to cover up your legs to hide the scars from the mauling by the crocodile? And she turned around and she said, the scars don't show weakness. It shows that you can get through anything. It doesn't make you ugly. It just shows that you're strong. Resilience is not the polar opposite of vulnerability. Vulnerability AIDS resilience. So we've looked at our leaders being strong and being seen to be strong, and how if you're vulnerable, we engage people more, giving more impact to our message and more strength to what we achieve. We've looked at our leaders being resilient and how you need to be open to everything that's happening around you and engage the support of other people. And finally, I want to look at leaders leading and being seen to take the lead. It's another cultural phenomenon that we put people on pedestals and we treat them as immortal. You only have to see what's happened in this country over the last few weeks. We do this to our royal family, we all know that. But after the Queen passed, we had the queue. You all know about the queue, don't you? Everyone in the world knows about the queue. Pure Britishness. But two of the biggest stories about the queue were about the behaviour of celebrities in the queue. One where two TV presenters were seen to jump the queue, and the other where David Beckham joined the queue. And they spoke volumes about how we put celebrities on pedestals and we expect them to be different to us. It was about standards of behaviour, the jumping the queue. And it was about David Beckham joining mere mortals in the queue, as if he's not a mere mortal. The guy was good at football. He is mortal. But we put our celebrities, we put our stars on pedestals. I was going to say politicians, but not sure that's so true anymore. Particularly not where I come from. I interviewed Hattie Webb for Just Ask. Hattie and her sister Charlie were the backing singers for Leonard Cohen for 8 years and for Tom Petty on his final tour. And Hattie told me two stories, one about each of those stars. Same story, effectively, but so resonant. She talked about being backstage with Leonard Cohen at a gig in Vancouver. And they were grabbing a coffee before going on stage. Real rock and roll story, this one, by the way. And Leonard Cohen was pouring himself a coffee, and his hand was shaking like crazy. And he saw Hattie looking at him, and he said, I know, even after all these years. She and her sister, Charlie, and Sharon Robinson, Tom Petty's songwriting partner, were in a buggy going to the stage at a gig in Austin, Texas. And Tom Petty turned to them and he said, I don't think I can do this. And they had to talk him down. These legends of rock, who had performed for decades at arenas and stadia all over the world, and even there, towards the end of their careers, the end of their lives, the nerves were kicking in and making a difference. We need to take people off their pedestal. We need to create a culture of connection, a culture of vulnerability, a culture of openness, where it's okay for people to share. We need to step down and join people. A few weeks ago, I delivered a presentation online to the global leadership team of one of the biggest consultancies in the world. About 15 or 20 of them in their offices in New York, the rest dialing in. I was sat at Heathrow Airport because they put the time back and I had to get a flight, so I'd booked a Regis and I was delivering from there. When we originally arranged it, my client, who had worked with at another company, had said to me, I really want you to do 2 hours because I want them to involve in conversation. Then she came back and said, we're getting pushed on the agenda, can you do 90 minutes? Then she came back and said, we're getting squeezed on the agenda, can you do an hour? We settled on 45 minutes. I joined my call 5-10 minutes before I was due. I got in with 20 minutes of my slot left. I had 20 minutes. I ditched my slides and I said, okay, I'm going to cover 4 key points. I dealt with the elephant in the room. We're up against time. I've got 4 things I want to get across. But my client has said, these guys like to talk. So I said, let's hear from 3 or 4 of you first, your perceptions and so on, and we'll build on that. And the first couple came in and spoke, but then all the hands in the room in New York and all the people in, the hands were going up. So I stopped it and I said, my plan was to go through these 4 points, but I can see you want to talk. I said, so if you're okay with it, I'm going to drop my entire presentation because I think we're going to address these points through what you're saying anyway. And that's what we did. And that landed better than that 2-hour presentation would have done. I'm sure of it. It's because you're hired and paid well for your expertise and experience. It doesn't make you the smartest person in the room. Sometimes we can help people by giving the best of ourselves. Often we help them by letting them find the best of themselves. Sean said yesterday, he talked about us as speakers having the fire and magic, but he also talked about giving that fire and magic to our audience. Sometimes being seen to lead means joining our audience, working with them rather than talking at them, to engage them to get to the next stage. You've all experienced low points like I experienced in Vancouver, and if you haven't, I promise that you are going to. It's how you deal with it that makes the difference. It's how you handle that. You can choose to be humiliated. You can choose to have the ground open up beneath you. You can choose to walk away, or you can choose to embrace it. You can choose to be open and vulnerable, understand what's happening, and work out how to use that to become stronger. We want and expect our leaders to be strong and to be seen to be strong. But that's not the polar opposite of vulnerability. Vulnerability helps you make that impact. We want and expect our leaders to be resilient and to be seen to be resilient. That's not the polar opposite of vulnerability. Vulnerability aids that resilience and gets you to that goal despite whatever the world throws at you. We want and expect our leaders to lead and to be seen to lead. Vulnerability doesn't get in the way of that. Vulnerability gets your ego out of the way and lets you engage with people in a real way. This platform, this stage that we're given the privilege to stand on, has its uses. It can be very practical, particularly, John, when you're as short as I am. But maybe there comes a time when we step off the stage, when we're open, when we're vulnerable, and when we choose to lead, not from above, but from among. Thank you very much.
Andy Lopata, like, phenomenal. Guarantee he's going to be mobbed, even by the people who know and love him already. That was phenomenal.